The Woodstock Festival of 1969 remains one of the most iconic events in music history. But while there were plenty of positives, it wasn't all dancing and holding hands. Here are some seriously messed up things that happened at Woodstock. Everyone remembers Joan Baez, The Who, Jimi Hendrix, Keith Hartley Band, and Quill, except that you actually probably don't remember those last two. That could be because those bands, who did indeed play at Woodstock, weren't featured in the same-named 1970 documentary film. Thus, they braved the mud and the electrically charged sound equipment, but ended up with very little name recognition for their troubles. The Oscar-winning documentary gave a publicity bump to the bands we now think of as the big-name performers of the era, while the bands who were left out of the film have been largely forgotten. Some of the artists who gave somewhat patchy performances, like the Grateful Dead and Janis Joplin, were also excluded from the original cut. But they were acknowledged in later releases, giving them a belated publicity bump. It just goes to show you that the memories of 500,000 stoned hippies may fade, but film is forever. Today, we think of hippies as gentle souls who believe in peace, love, and taking care of Mother Earth. But in the late 60s, they mostly just cared about those first two items, and not so much the third. Or at least the hippies at Woodstock didn't act like they were concerned about the environment at the festival. According to a 1969 article in the Village Voice, there were piles of garbage up and down the hillside a month after the festival. There was evidently some effort to keep the site clean during the festival, as trash bags were passed around the audience at various points. But it wasn't enough to keep the garbage from inundating the nearby woods and the shoulders of most roads. Perhaps organizers should have billed the festival as 3 days of peace, music, and sanitation. Maybe that would have saved them something on the cleanup. Woodstock was a generation-defining, epic, historical moment that became enshrined in musical history and America's collective consciousness. But for organizers, it pretty much sucked. It's probably safe to say that the four guys who put the festival together really had no idea what they were getting themselves into. They were all in their 20s, and the only real qualifications they had were green pieces of paper with pictures of presidents on them. When they settled on the idea of putting on a concert, they decided the best way to get big names was to offer double the money that they usually got. They were already kind of over their heads before the festival turned into a free-for-all. But then traffic became such a problem that they had to contract helicopters to fly in food, supplies, and their very expensive performers. It got so bad that the festival was nearly canceled. On the second day, some of the performers were having temper tantrums and demanded upfront pay in cash. So organizers convinced a local bank to front them an emergency midnight loan using a personal trust fund as collateral. And the show went on, though it probably was only bittersweet for the organizers, since the loan wasn't exactly going to help them turn a profit, but instead just prevent 500,000 people from getting really angry. While Woodstock was billed as 3 days of peace and music, it's probably more accurate to say it was 3 days of mud, rain, and food shortages. Festival goers might have been super enthusiastic on the opening Friday, but by Sunday, a lot of them had pretty much had it. Thus, by the time headliner Jimi Hendrix got on stage, the crowd had dwindled from a peak of 500,000 to around 180,000. The schedule was so badly mucked up by Sunday that performers were taking the stage literally hours after they were scheduled to appear. Plus, Hendrix had a clause in his contract that virtually guaranteed most fans would miss his performance. No one was allowed to perform after him, and since Sunday's schedule was so hideously delayed, he didn't get on stage until Monday morning, which incidentally was the fourth day of the 3-day festival. Although he gave what is widely considered to be a legendary performance, most of the exhausted, hungry, dirt-covered people who came to see him had already given up and were on their way home. According to Snopes, those old stories from the 60s about kids taking LSD and staring at the sun until they went blind are completely bogus. However, Mary Sanderson, a nurse who worked at Woodstock, reported that burned eyeballs were actually a thing at the festival. She claimed that they appeared to have resulted from kids on LSD who would lie down on their backs and just stare. Now that really sounds like a bad trip.
The Beach Boys were a huge part of the soundtrack of the 60s, and even people born decades after they reached their height of popularity are bound to know their music. Good Vibrations, California Girls, Surfin' Safari, great Beach Boys songs aren't exactly rare. Despite their huge successes and enduring legacy, however, their story isn't exactly a happy one. Murray Wilson was the father of Beach Boys Brian, Dennis, and Carl, as well as their first manager. And put simply, he was a pretty horrible guy. In I Am Brian Wilson, a memoir, Brian spoke about the abuse they suffered at the hands of their father. He wrote, "My dad was violent. He was cruel." How cruel? Well, the Beach Boys songwriter and composer became deaf in one ear thanks to a blow from a lead pipe delivered to his head as a 3-year-old. As children, Brian says they were all on the receiving end of abuse. He himself was once handed a beating with a 2x4, for example, but it was only Dennis who ever fought back. The psychological abuse was there too. When they were children, Murray would pull out his glass eye and make the boys stare into the empty, gaping hole of his socket.
Did you live in fear of your father?
Yeah.
How did you get away from that?
When the Beach Boys came along.
Murray also consistently berated them during his time as their manager. He told them that they were losers, they were worthless, and they were failures. In 2010, The Guardian reported on the discovery of a letter handwritten by Murray and addressed to Brian. Dated May 8, 1965, a time when the Beach Boys were enjoying chart-topping success, it read, "It has become very apparent to me that the family cannot exist under the worrisome and trying conditions that have been going on for the last 5 or 6 years. No matter how many hit songs you write or how many hundreds of thousands of dollars you may earn, you are going to suffer remorse." Over the course of his life, Brian Wilson became more and more reclusive, even as he continued to write songs for the band. According to The Independent, his preferred place to write was at his LA home, sitting at a grand piano he had put in a homemade sandbox so he could feel his feet in the sand. There, he composed and arranged the music for 9 consecutive gold albums. In fact, he did pretty much everything except write the lyrics. But Wilson was also frequently partaking in amphetamines, LSD, and morphine, and topped it all off with alcohol too. Brian became obsessed with the idea he was being bugged and would only meet with people from what he perceived as the safety of his pool. When a rash of forest fires coincided with him writing the song Fire, he started to believe his music was influencing real-world events. He started to hear voices too. And while some of them loved him, others promised to kill him. Wilson retreated even further into himself and was only 25 years old when he largely dropped out of the public eye. Since then, Wilson has been diagnosed with a schizoaffective disorder, but it was still a long time before he got the help he needed. The entire saga of Charles Manson, his family, and the murders perpetrated by them is a strange one indeed, and it's made even more bizarre by an incident in which his story had a bizarre crossover episode with the Beach Boys. It was the summer of '68 when drummer Dennis Wilson hooked up with the Manson clan and spent a few months completely lost in drug-fueled debauchery. It all started after Dennis picked up a few hitchhiking Manson devotees and continued because of Charles Manson's own musical aspirations.
And on our way back to the studio at Brian's house where we were recording, I said, "Well, Dennis, you really have an interesting character on your hands now."
Once Manson started showing Dennis how to play guitar, the hooks were in. They even lived together on Dennis' dime until things suddenly went sour. Dennis offered Manson the opportunity to hit the recording studio, but when the producers tried to make some changes to his music, Manson pulled out a knife.
"They came to the ranch, lady. I didn't go to them. They came to me. You're stealing my music every day. You're writing my songs. You're playing my game."
The entire episode left a lasting impact, however, as did the legendary events that took place soon after. Even though Dennis vowed to never speak of his time with Charles Manson, Mike Love mentioned the episode in his memoir, Good Vibrations. He wrote, "The guilt was devastating. Dennis was shaken to the core. He carried that guilt with him for the last 14 years of his life." Pet Sounds was an iconic album, and that cover is pretty iconic too. It was shot at the San Diego Zoo, and the San Diego Tribune reports that the cover was rumored to be a direct message to their rivals, the animals. Whatever their motivation was for shooting the cover at the zoo, however, the whole thing didn't go too well.
Whoa! We couldn't believe it. Great title, you know. So in about a couple of days later, we hauled ass down to San Diego Zoo.
Ultimately, the Beach Boys were banned from ever setting foot in the zoo again, and there's a long list of bizarre shenanigans that went on during their visit. Names aren't named, but someone thought it was a brilliant idea to bounce a carrot off a tiger's head. Someone else tried to manhandle an antelope, and somehow they got hold of a few puppies and baby chicks, leaving them in strategic places around the zoo. Meanwhile, the band claimed that they were the ones really suffering, with the goats that made it onto the final album cover said to be particularly awful, but those puppies probably felt differently. It was Christmas Day, 1983, when, according to Rolling Stone, Dennis Wilson was turned away from the detox unit at a California hospital, with one doctor allegedly claiming he was just too much trouble to deal with. Dennis was dead 3 days later. Dennis drowned in the waters off Marina del Rey, where he'd been hanging out with friends, drinking and diving off a boat called Emerald. He had a blood alcohol content of 0.26 when he made his final dive and didn't come up again. He was 39 years old. The years leading up to that day were rough. As early as 1963, his spot at the drums was being filled by a studio drummer, but it wasn't until 1979 that Dennis was finally kicked out of the band. Prior to that, Wilson had started using heroin, and he was the abuser in a relationship with actress Karen Lamb, whom he once nearly killed with a gun. He torched a Ferrari, checked in and out of hospitals, and destroyed Christine McVie's house, all while on alcoholic, drug-fueled rages. Then there was the last straw. Dennis hooked up with his second cousin, the 16-year-old daughter of Mike Love. That went over about as well as you might expect, and restraining orders were issued between the two bandmates. After that, there were more drugs, more alcohol, and when Dennis died, the band announced they wouldn't be disbanding and only took a short break to mourn. So, what about Mike Love? Cousin to the brothers and lead vocalist on songs like California Girls and I Get Around. When he talked to Rock Cellar in 2016, they touched on what seems to be an apt description of his dual personality, the switchblade and the butterfly. While Love admitted that he could see how his particular sense of humor could come off as crass at times, a lot of what he's done has all been in good fun. That's what he says, at least. Given how many times he's taken Brian to court, you can see how people would be mistaken. Love told Rock Cellar that his main lawsuit against Brian stemmed from a single place: his claim that he wrote a number of Beach Boys songs, including Surfin' USA and Help Me Rhonda, but was never given his songwriting credits. Love said, "I'm not taking credit for Brian's brilliant arrangements or production or anything like that, and I'm not saying I could have done it on my own. I'm saying that there was not an accurate picture of who did what when it came to the creation of these songs." That 1992 lawsuit was just one of many, and one of the main reasons he's been labeled the villain of the Beach Boys. Love feels this reputation isn't deserved, and told Rolling Stone that while he laughs off all the hate most of the time, it does sometimes break him. In 1988, Kokomo shot to the top of the charts, 24 years and 4 months after the Beach Boys' first chart topper, I Get Around. There's not much those two songs have in common, and there's a pretty good reason for that. Kokomo was written for Tom Cruise's movie Cocktail, and it wasn't written by the musical genius behind most of the Beach Boys songs either. According to Entertainment Weekly, you can blame a number of different writers and musicians, including Mike Love, for Kokomo, the song that's probably stuck in your head right now. At the time, Brian was under the constant supervision of the psychotherapist Eugene Landy, and Landy forbade Brian's initial involvement with the song, although he did show up in the video.
Landy would let Brian record with us only if Landy could be the co-writer or the co-producer of the record and stuff.
It's also worth noting that there is no actual Kokomo, although one island was briefly renamed after the success of the song. Oh, and that it was once performed live at Mar-a-Lago. Yes, that Mar-a-Lago. Carl Wilson died in 1998, only a few months after touring with the band for their 36th annual summer tour. The official cause of death was complications from lung cancer, although he had also previously been diagnosed with brain cancer. Wilson was only 51 years old. Obituaries, historians, and those who knew him remembered him as the group's heart, and the one who grounded the rest through all the chaos. Beach Boys publicist Sandy Friedman said, "Carl was like a rock for the group. He was the steady one. He was the tiller." Mike Love agreed and told Rock Cellar in his interview that of all the hard times they've been through as a band and a family, the hardest was the final tour with Carl. He said after his last concert with us in Atlantic City the year before he passed away, seeing Carl Wilson take a look at all of us and saying goodbye for the last time to everybody, which is basically what it was, that was really hard to think about again. Even though their music inspired countless lifetimes of happy-go-lucky fun in the sun, the Beach Boys didn't walk an easy road. Brian Wilson and Mike Love have both talked a little about the early days of the band with the benefit of hindsight, and perhaps most tragic of all is that their memories are tinged with both respect and regrets. In his 2016 interview with Rock Cellar, Love said Brian had been gifted with, quote, a supercharged packet of genealogy that gave rise to his brilliance in music. And while acknowledging his rocky relationship with Dennis, he also gave credit where it was due. Love said he was a very powerful drummer and he had that competitive spirit. When Rolling Stone talked to Brian in 2016, he admitted there was plenty that he missed about those days. He missed hanging with Dennis, for example. He missed Carl too, saying, "I miss hearing him talk, the things he has to say." And Love? Brian said he hoped that broken relationship would be repaired someday. He added, "My favorite part of music is harmony. That's the part of music I like the most. I like the full harmony."
Breaking reality with too many drugs, a pre-planned hit job, and authenticity taken too far. The music industry of the 60s was a symphony of sound and scandal that not even the hippie revolution could tame. In the 1950s, being an American radio disc jockey was a lucrative career. By slipping DJs a few extra dollars, record companies could buy airplay and all but ensure that their artist's song would become a hit, a practice called payola. But in 1960, Congress declared payola a criminal act. Amidst the chaotic hearings, two of America's most popular DJs, Dick Clark and Alan Freed, came into question.
All the money, all the shadiness, all the payola is to attract the attention of kids like this.
Both Clark and Freed denied ever having accepted under-the-table payments in exchange for radio play. but everyone was more inclined to believe the more mainstream Clarke, despite his having recently offloaded several incriminating assets, than the defiant Freed, who popularized the term rock and roll and regularly advocated for black artists. Clarke walked away relatively unscathed, but Freed was charged with commercial bribery, heavily fined, and fired from his job. He died virtually penniless of complications related to alcoholism just a few years later in 1965. In 1955, the song Black Denim Trousers and Motorcycle Boots by the Cheers seemed to predict the early death of actor James Dean in a car accident. It became a hit, the music industry saw dollar signs, and the teen tragedy song was born. The popularity of the morbid genre reached an all-time high in the early 1960s. Songs like the Shangri-La's Leader of the Pack, in which a breakup causes the singer's rogue boyfriend to die in a motorcycle accident, and both Wayne Cochran's Last Kiss and Jan and Dean's Dead Man's Curve, which depict deadly car accidents, became huge hits with rebellious youth of the time. The 1960s saw a major cultural shift toward female equality in the bedroom, but it certainly didn't come easily. The so-called sexual revolution kicked off in 1960 when the then newly invented birth control pill became more widely available. That same year, the Shirelles, a black all-girl group, had a hit with Will You Love Me Tomorrow. Though seemingly innocent, lines like "Is this a lasting treasure or just a moment's pleasure?" candidly discuss female sexuality and casual intimacy, leading many American radio stations to ban the song. Nonetheless, music continued to fuel the female sexual revolution as the 60s wore on, with hit songs like Leslie Gore's You Don't Own Me and Martha and the Vandellas' Heat Wave further establishing young women as free-thinking members of society, motivated by their own desires. Known as the King of Soul, Sam Cooke popularized R&B and soul music in the 1950s and early 60s through his accessible hits like Cupid, You Send Me, and What a Wonderful World. By age 33, Cooke had 29 singles in Billboard's Top 40 and a newly acquired record label under his belt. But unfortunately, his career and his life ended far too soon. On December 11, 1964, Cooke checked into a motel in Los Angeles, California with Elisa Boyer, a young woman he had met that night in Hollywood. A little later, motel manager Aretha Franklin claimed that she shot Cooke in self-defense after he confronted her while looking for Boyer. Police received 2 calls about the incident, one from the motel's owner and another from Boyer, who alleged that she had been kidnapped and assaulted. Based on these accounts, police deemed Cooke's death a justifiable homicide, but many weren't convinced. Witnesses suggested that Boyer, who was later convicted of murdering her boyfriend, may have been robbing Cooke. Meanwhile, Cooke's family and friends disputed the given versions of events, implying that his manager, or enemies he made as a civil rights activist, had carried out a murder plot. As progressive musicians pushed the boundaries of society in the 1960s, government censors found themselves busier than ever trying to block lyrics with curse words, overt sexuality, promotion of drug use, or other scenarios they deemed obscene. And some of those other scenarios were pretty weird. For instance, consider the condemnation of wholesome songs like Peter, Paul and Mary's fantastical Puff the Magic Dragon, allegedly an elaborate drug metaphor, and the Beach Boys' God Only Knows, deemed blasphemous for merely mentioning God in a rock song. A bit of a stretch. Not to mention the silliness of the FBI investigating the Kingsmen's Louie Louie simply because they couldn't understand the lyrics. But by far the most extreme example of 60s censorship came from Brazil. Artists like Caetano Veloso and Gilberto Gil faced opposition from the country's military dictatorship, which felt the music promoted anarchy. Both were imprisoned for months, banned from performing, and later exiled from Brazil. Formed in Liverpool, England, the Beatles quickly grew to become a worldwide sensation in the early 1960s. The group's rise to fame was so sudden and intense that singer-guitarist John Lennon was inspired to comment on it. In a conversational March 4, 1966 interview with the London Evening Standard, Lennon casually shared his thoughts on religion, saying, "Christianity will go. It will vanish and shrink. I needn't argue about that. I'm right, and I will be proved right. We're more popular than Jesus now. I don't know which will go first, rock and roll or Christianity." The interview ran without incident in England, but his candid musings quickly evolved into a PR nightmare in America. Religious groups, particularly fundamentalist Christians, were outraged, boycotting the band, publicly burning records, and citing Lennon's words as proof that rock music was inherently evil. Eventually, the rage even inspired death threats, and a reluctant Lennon was forced to issue a formal apology.
I just said what I said, and it was wrong, or was taken wrong, and now it's all this.
Throughout the 1950s, the music industry standard was mass-producing hit songs using a songwriting team and polished session musicians, then presenting them to the masses with an attractive pop star figurehead. That inspired a backlash, as a desire for authenticity helped spawn the folk revival movement of the early 60s. It was, at its core, a stripped-down, acoustic-only opposition to the glitz and glam of the music industry machine. So imagine everyone's horror when one of folk's most beloved figures, Bob Dylan, employed the use of an electric guitar in the summer of 1965. The betrayal audiences felt was so great that, amidst the nightly sea of boos, someone was even heard calling Dylan Judas at an England show.
Did you see one paper that said, "Everybody walked out"?
I haven't seen that one.
Everybody walked out. I saw a paper that said, "Everybody walked out."
Then came the Monkees. Manufactured in America to capitalize on the popularity of the Beatles, the Monkees, a fully casted and made-for-TV band, were seen by many as the antithesis of authenticity. They came pre-packaged with a television show, which focused mostly on their banter, and were backed by a prolific songwriting team. Though they later attempted to reclaim authenticity by writing their own songs, most never viewed them as real artists. In 1959, Buddy Holly, the Big Bopper, and Ritchie Valens died in a plane crash, an event that became known as the day the music died. Sadly, it was just the first of many rock tragedies. On March 5, 1963, country music star Patsy Cline, along with fellow musicians Cowboy Copas and Hawkshaw Hawkins, were killed in a plane crash. Then, on July 31, 1964, country music lost another star when Jim Reeves, piloting his own plane, flew through a storm and wrecked near Nashville. And soul singer-songwriter Otis Redding was at the top of his game when he died in a plane crash on December 10, 1967. His final song, an unfinished version of Sittin' on the Dock of the Bay, became a massive hit after his death. Rock gained momentum throughout the 60s, fueled by British bands like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, as well as American groups like the Beach Boys and the Doors. There was just one problem. Mainstream rock stars were primarily white men, even though the music had its roots in black culture. How this came to be is a matter of debate. Many argue that the separation began in the 50s, with music industry executives not wanting to market black music to white audiences. Others claim that black artists segregated themselves by focusing on soul and R&B rather than rock. Still, artists like the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and Led Zeppelin were heavily influenced by black musicians like Muddy Waters and Chuck Berry. Rock historian Jack Hamilton posits that the exclusion of black artists from the evolving genre of rock in the 60s ultimately came down to systemic racism. Throughout the decade, Jimi Hendrix was the only black musician able to successfully break the barrier. Women were similarly excluded from 60s rock, which frequently objectified them in its lyrics. Janis Joplin was one of the only women able to transcend this sexist gap, and critics often reduced her to a novelty. While known to most as the leader of a cult that committed several horrific murders, Charles Manson was first an aspiring musician. After learning the guitar in prison, he headed west to Los Angeles, California in 1967, where he befriended the likes of Neil Young and the Beach Boys drummer Dennis Wilson. In fact, Manson and Wilson became so close that they lived together and collaborated on the Beach Boys' 1968 song, Never Learn Not to Love. It was a brief partnership, with Manson receiving a single payment for his contribution before being sent on his way. Manson then became enamored with the Beatles' White Album, listening to the songs obsessively until he became convinced that its lyrics included hidden messages about a coming race war. This delusional fixation culminated in the brutal murders of 9 people in 1969. At one of the crime scenes, a Manson follower had even written the name of a Beatles song, Helter Skelter, albeit misspelled, in blood on the refrigerator door. When Woodstock's promoters were forced to find a new location just weeks before the event, many basic amenities went by the wayside. Nearly 500,000 people arrived in rural upstate New York to find limited bathrooms and inadequate supplies of food and water. What's worse, thunderstorms and heavy rainfall, combined with shoddy electrical wiring and flimsy stage fixtures, created a potentially dangerous situation, not to mention a muddy mess. Woodstock's organizers were also completely unprepared for the event's high turnout. Roads were blocked for miles, meaning emergency supplies had to be delivered by air, and many artists were unable to perform because they couldn't get to the location. Hungry attendees stripped adjacent corn crops, angering the area's farmers. In fact, the festival was made free simply because the outnumbered staff was unable to check tickets. While many concert goers became ill and several overdosed on drugs, the festival was mostly incident-free, though one person was run over by a tractor and killed. Despite the ongoing hippie movement, which promoted nonviolence, attending concerts became increasingly hazardous in the 1960s. On March 1, 1967, Eric Burdon and the Animals refused to perform at a concert in Ottawa, Canada. Irate fans destroyed the stage and set fires, leading to 12 arrests. Then, on December 9, 1967, a Connecticut Doors concert spiraled out of control. Frontman Jim Morrison was maced backstage by a police officer. During the show, he began mocking the police. In response, they jumped on stage and arrested him in the middle of the concert. The arrest sparked a riot, with 13 more arrests made. But the decade's worst incident by far took place at the Altamont Free Festival on December 6, 1969. Here's what we know for sure. Members of the Hells Angels motorcycle gang worked security at the event in exchange for $500 worth of beer. Who exactly hired and paid them is still debated today. Some say it was the Rolling Stones, while others say it was all the Grateful Dead's doing. Regardless, during Jefferson Airplane's performance, an angel ended up knocking out singer Marty Ballin during a melee on stage. Things completely went off the rails during the Rolling Stones set. Mick Jagger begged the crowd to remain calm and chastised the Angels for their roughhousing. What happened next is one of the most infamous to occur at any concert ever. A fan produced a gun and was aiming it at either the stage or in the air, depending on how you see it. An angel jumped him and stabbed 18-year-old Meredith Hunter to death.
I can't do any more than just ask you, to beg you just to keep it together.
Throughout the decade, recreational drug use was a part of the rock and roll counterculture. Hallucinogenic substances like LSD and marijuana were said to expand the mind and provide a means of understanding the world on a deeper level. They became firmly entrenched with 60s music, particularly the then newly formed genre of psychedelic rock. But such wanton use took its toll. Syd Barrett, the founding member of Pink Floyd, broke from reality after overusing LSD and became unable to perform. Prolonged use of drugs and alcohol also claimed the lives of many. Virtuoso guitarist Jimi Hendrix, R&B singer-songwriter Frankie Lyman, Beatles manager Brian Epstein, and blues singer Janis Joplin were just a few of the 60s music legends who died of complications related to substance use at startlingly young ages. If you or anyone you know needs help with addiction issues, help is available. Visit the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration website or contact SAMHSA's National Helpline at 1-800-662-HELP, 1-800-662-4357.
Frank Zappa's childhood exposure to mustard gas, David Crosby's Texas prison sentence, and Brian Wilson's lifelong mental health struggles. That's just the beginning. Keep watching to hear more of the most tragic stories from 60s rock legends. On December 6, 1969, the Rolling Stones performed at the Altamont Speedway in California. The festival was a challenge from the start as the crowds were becoming increasingly difficult to control. It wasn't helped that security was being provided by the notorious Hells Angels Bike Club. Several fights occurred before the Rolling Stones performed, and at one point, security knocked out Marty Ballin of Jefferson Airplane. Soon after, the Grateful Dead refused to play, even though the band's manager was the one who had urged the festival's organizers to use the Hells Angels in the first place. When Mick Jagger walked from the Stones helicopter to the stage, a concert goer punched him. He unsuccessfully tried to calm the audience, and the bikers allegedly didn't like his flashy dance moves. These factors and others created a dismal mood, and by their third song, Sympathy for the Devil, the Stones were still having trouble engaging with the crowd.
There's so many of you. Just be cool down the front and don't push around.
Then, a concert goer named Meredith Hunter took out a gun after trying and failing to get on stage. One of the Hells Angels stabbed him, and the rest beat him to death, all while the band remained unaware of what was happening. Afterwards, Jagger distanced himself from the bikers, saying he would never partner with them again. The Hells Angels were infuriated too, because they believed Jagger had sold them out. They even hatched a plot to kill him in revenge, which was only foiled after the would-be assassin's boat was hit by stormy weather. Jagger was unaware of the plot, as the FBI wasn't forthcoming about the information until many years later. In 1976, Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones had one of the worst years of his life. That's when his 2-month-old son, Tara Jojo Gunn, died in Geneva, Switzerland, of sudden infant death syndrome. Richards later told the BBC that he was only able to make it through the pain because the band was performing in Paris, France that same night. He revealed, "I thought, I'm going to go mad unless I do this show tonight." Some may think it odd that he decided to perform at all, but for Richards, it acted as a form of self-preservation and a way for him to block out his emotions. He said, "It was a rough thing, and I had a feeling I must go on stage now, and I'll worry and grieve and think about all this after the show." Jagger added that if he didn't perform, there was a good chance that he would have attempted to take his own life. Richards and model Anita Pallenberg had 3 children together, and Tara was the youngest. The couple stayed together for 12 years, but never tied the knot, and they split up in 1979. Guitarist and frontman Syd Barrett was one of the founding members of Pink Floyd. He began experimenting with LSD in 1965 and eventually had a difficult time staying in tune with reality. When David Gilmour saw him at a recording studio in 1967, he was shocked by how much the guitarist had changed since their previous meeting. Gilmour later remembered, "Syd didn't seem to recognize me and just stared back." Barrett's behavior caused the band to cancel gigs, before they eventually replaced him with Gilmour in 1968. Some believe Barrett had schizophrenia, which may have been caused by heavy drug use as well as stress from his work. Fellow band member Roger Waters, friends, and others noted that Barrett often had odd thoughts. Years later, Waters explained,
"If you were in the position of being an incipient schizophrenic like he was, any hallucinogenics are a very bad thing."
Barrett generally exhibited strange behavior, delusions, visions, and more. He also suffered from diabetes as he got older, which commonly occurs in people with schizophrenia as a result of certain antipsychotic medications. After leaving Pink Floyd, Barrett withdrew from the public eye and died in 2006 at the age of 60. Keith Moon was the drummer of The Who until his death in 1978 due to an accidental drug overdose. But it was an incident 8 years earlier that left an indelible mark on the musician's life. On January 4th, 1970, Moon, his wife, and some friends went to a pub in Hatfield, England. The pub was frequented by working-class locals who didn't appreciate Moon's lavish tastes, including his Bentley and his love of brandy. When the pub closed, the crowd showed its displeasure by trying to prevent Moon and his party from leaving in their vehicle. Pubgoers started rocking Moon's Bentley, prompting his driver, friend, and bodyguard Neil Boland to get out of the vehicle and confront the crowd, which included a number of skinheads. Moon then tried to drive himself and his friends away from the pub. In the process, Boland got stuck under the Bentley and was killed after being dragged down the street. Police charged Moon with Boland's death, drunk driving, driving without a license, and driving without insurance. Although the incident was later ruled to have been an accident, Boland's death affected Moon for the rest of his life. Janis Joplin was a force to be reckoned with in the 1960s. She was known for tunes such as Try Just a Little Bit Harder, Maybe, and Piece of My Heart, and performed at Woodstock in 1969. Unfortunately, just a year later, she died as a result of her drug and alcohol addiction. Joplin liked drinking and taking methamphetamine and heroin. She had periods when she was sober, but the allure of getting high was often too hard for her to resist. On October 4th, 1970, she missed a recording session in Los Angeles. and her manager decided to see if she was still at her hotel. He found her, dead on the floor of her room. Joplin died of a heroin overdose that was likely exacerbated by alcoholism. Many believe the heroin she used was stronger than usual, since other people that used the same dealer also overdosed in the same time period. Joplin was 27 years old, and her death occurred just weeks after Jimi Hendrix died at the same age. In 1971, Joplin's posthumous album Pearl was released, including the last song she recorded, Mercedes-Benz. It was the best-selling album of her career. Singer Roy Orbison had 9 top 10 hits between 1960 and 1965. He wasn't your typical rock star either, with his thick eyeglasses and songs focusing on heartache. Part of that heartache undoubtedly came from his on-off wife, Claudette Frady Orbison. The Orbisons wed in 1957, but Claudette had an affair in 1963. They divorced soon after, but reunited and wed for a second time in 1965. Claudette was often around motorcycles as a child, and it was reportedly Elvis Presley who got Roy interested in them. In 1966, only a year after they remarried, Claudette died in a motorcycle crash in Old Hickory, Tennessee. Roy was riding in front of Claudette on a different motorcycle when the accident occurred. 2 months later, Roy's song, Too Soon to Know, hit number 3 on the British charts, featuring lyrics that alluded to Claudette's death. Roy's loss would be compounded in 1968 too, when his 2 oldest sons with Claudette died in a house fire. When it came to his music, the unconventional and inventive rocker Frank Zappa wasn't confined by mere genres, and despite dying relatively young, he managed to carry out a wildly successful and fascinating 30-year career. Zappa's father was an Italian immigrant, chemist, and mathematician who worked as a contractor for the defense industry. Growing up, Zappa was exposed to mustard gas and other chemicals, which could have been linked to his poor health over the years. This included radium pellets, which a doctor used to treat a young Zappa's sinusitis. He also dealt with asthma and a number of other ear, nose, and throat maladies. After coping with urinary problems for several years, the musician was diagnosed with prostate cancer in 1990. Unfortunately, the cancer had been in his body for several years, and doctors discovered the problem in its late stages, so there was no operable solution. He spent the last couple of years of his life working on the orchestral album, The Yellow Shark. In his final interview, he said he had good days and bad days, but smoked cigarettes the entire time, claiming, "To me, a cigarette is food. Tobacco is my favorite vegetable." Zappa died in Los Angeles at the age of 52. Singer and songwriter David Crosby is known for being a part of the iconic rock bands The Byrds and Crosby, Stills and Nash. Like many of his contemporaries, he also drank a lot of alcohol and took a lot of drugs during his younger years. An incident in the early 80s at a nightclub sent Crosby to a Texas prison for a weapons charge and drug possession. 3 years later, he was arrested in California and charged with a DUI, hit and run, possession of a concealed weapon, and possession of drug paraphernalia. The silver lining was that serving time behind bars helped Crosby battle his drug addiction. He revealed in 2019, "I had tried going into treatment and it didn't work. I went into prison and it worked. It was a way to do it." Unfortunately, at one point Crosby was diagnosed with hepatitis C, which can be contracted by sharing needles. In 1994, fellow musician Phil Collins paid for a liver transplant for Crosby. This sparked a controversy in the media, however, when critics suggested that he had received his donor liver quickly because he was rich and famous. His operation also led to a debate over whether ex-addicts should be eligible for organ transplants in the first place. Grateful Dead frontman Jerry Garcia died in a California drug treatment center in 1995 at the age of 53. Arguably the most prominent jam band of the 1960s, the Grateful Dead combined blues, rock, country, and a number of other genres of music, and fans were unsurprisingly distraught by his passing at such a relatively young age. However, years of excessive drug use eventually took their toll on the musician's health. In addition to being addicted to cocaine and heroin, Garcia also had diabetes, and 3 years prior to his death, he had collapsed after a performance in California. According to a spokesman, Garcia checked himself into rehab because he recognized that he had a problem with his health. Former bandmate and drummer Mickey Hart later told Rolling Stone that Garcia was sick from all the abuse his body had endured over the years, causing his heart to simply give out. During the 1960s, Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys was plagued by excessive substance use and mental health issues, problems that would take years to control. In 1964, the singer-songwriter had a nervous breakdown, and he used drugs, including cocaine, marijuana, and LSD, to battle his subsequent depression. In 1965, Wilson began to experience auditory hallucinations, and soon after displayed paranoid and antisocial tendencies.
Do you think the source of the problems that you had was the psychedelic drugs?
Yes.
Yeah?
The psychedelic drugs messed my life up.
Doctors eventually diagnosed him with schizoaffective disorder. He later told Ability magazine that the voices in his head were derogatory and discouraging, saying, "I have to be strong enough to say to them, 'Hey, would you quit stalking me? Don't talk to me. Leave me alone.'" Medication has helped Wilson through his recovery, as has his second wife, Melinda. She helped him find the right doctors and created a loving family environment for the musician. Still, it's not always easy for Wilson to keep it together, and even today, some days are better than others. He revealed in 2019, "There were times when it was unbearable, but with doctors and medications, I've been able to live a wonderful, healthy, and productive life with support from my family, friends, and fans who have helped me through this journey." If you or someone you know is struggling with mental health, please contact the Crisis Text Line by texting HOME to 741-741. Call the National Alliance on Mental Illness Helpline at 1-800-950-NAMI. Or visit the National Institute of Mental Health website.
He may have had the Folsom Prison Blues, but it wasn't until Johnny Cash found himself in a real ring of fire that the feds came a-knocking, and he isn't alone on the wrong side of the law. Papa John Phillips was one of the most important musicians of the 60s, due in large part to his work with the Mamas and the Papas. He was also an afflicted man, with a life marked by drug addiction and unstable relationships. In 2009, his daughter, Mackenzie Phillips, a successful actor and singer in her own right, leveled a shocking allegation against him, that they had an abusive relationship throughout the early part of her life. In her book High on Arrival, and in a subsequent interview on Oprah, Mackenzie claims she awoke to him assaulting her around age 17, and that it went on for a decade. It only ended after she got pregnant.
I had an abortion, and I never let him touch me again.
While the rest of the Phillips family acknowledged that John wasn't exactly a saint, they're all of different minds on Mackenzie's allegations. John's ex-wives, Michelle Phillips and Genevieve Waite, didn't believe the allegations. Michelle told The Hollywood Reporter that Mackenzie was mentally unwell, while Genevieve released a statement saying she did not believe John was capable of it. John and Michelle's daughter, China Phillips, however, fully believes her half-sister.
Yeah, I knew. I knew for 13 years.
Jessica Woods, daughter of John's bandmate, Denny Doherty, emailed Oprah and said, "Everything she said is true. My dad told me the awful truth. He was horrified at what John had done and knew all of it." On January 16, 1980, Paul McCartney flew into Tokyo to kick off a tour of Japan with his band Wings. As history details, upon arrival, Japanese authorities found about half a pound of marijuana in McCartney's belongings and arrested him. He was charged with smuggling, even though he claimed it was for personal use, which didn't exactly help his case. The entire ordeal saw him detained for 9 days before getting deported from the country.
I still am hazy as to how that happened, but it did.
It's true that the Beatles were always associated with drug use, and even though it's still illegal in many places, a rock legend smoking a joint is largely a victimless crime. That is, unless you're in Japan, a country with both stringent drug laws and, as Vice notes, a strong social stigma against drug use. Though the legal consequences are enormous, the social consequences are life-changing. As Japan-based journalist Brian Ashcraft explained in a column on Kotaku, if you're in Japan, keep this mantra in mind. Never do drugs in this country, ever. Beside the risk of lengthy jail sentences, stars, big and small, have seen their careers come to screeching halts after getting charged with drug possession. McCartney got off easy. In 2004, he revealed why he was so cavalier about taking drugs on a plane. This stuff was too good to flush down the toilet, so I thought I'd take it with me. In March of 1969, The Doors performed in Miami, Florida. Lead singer Jim Morrison was, by most accounts, drunk and erratic. By some accounts, he taunted the crowd and exposed himself. This led to him getting charged with a felony and 3 misdemeanors for his behavior. Whether or not he disrobed is a source of contention to this day, but there's a preponderance of evidence that he didn't. History notes that almost all the witnesses for the prosecution had connections to the cops or the district attorney. Indeed, the Miami Herald interviewed at least 3 people in attendance, all of whom deny that Morrison dropped trout except for an off-duty cop present that night. Doors drummer John Dinsmore told The Hollywood Reporter, "He didn't do it. I was there. If Jim had revealed the golden shaft, I would have known. There were hundreds of photographs taken and tons of cops and no evidence." Either way, the trial ended with Morrison convicted of indecent exposure and open profanity. Morrison posted bail and was still appealing his conviction when he died in France. In 2010, Florida Governor Charlie Crist posthumously pardoned Morrison. Per Reuters, Crist said this was because Morrison's death robbed him of the right of appeal. Wilson Pickett gave us Land of Thousand Dances in the mid-60s. He also became the man of a dozen crimes in the 90s, most of them drunk driving related. In 1991, Pickett was charged with drunk driving after flooring his Chevy Silverado over his neighbor's yard and threatening him per UPI. This neighbor just happened to be the mayor of Englewood, New Jersey.
The wicked Wilson Pickett.
Jet reported that Pickett agreed to perform a charity concert in order to have the charges dropped. This was far from the end of his problems with drunk driving. While intoxicated behind the wheel, Pickett drove his car into an 86-year-old pedestrian in 1993. The AP reported a strict sentence for that one: 1 year in prison, 5 years probation, a $5,000 fine, alcohol treatment, and 200 hours of community service. No charity concert here. The Who were synonymous with destruction, and drummer Keith Moon in particular has his share of wild stories. Many of those stories are tragic, including the little-remembered incident where he accidentally killed a man. The precise details are a bit fuzzy, but coverage by Rolling Stone and research by journalist and Moon biographer Tony Fletcher suss out a sorry scene. In January of 1970, Moon and some friends visited a pub in Hatfield, Hertfordshire. Among those friends was Neil Boland, a chauffeur he hired with the expectation of being wasted. When the group left the pub, they were accosted by skinheads who weren't pleased seeing a rich man with a fancy car in their neighborhood. Boland either left the car or was pulled out, at which point Moon took the wheel and drove to safety, unknowingly driving over, dragging, and killing Boland. Moon pleaded guilty to drunk driving, driving without a license, and driving without insurance. Even so, after more details emerged, the court cleared him of all charges. According to Rolling Stone, the judge even said, "You had no choice but to act the way you did, and no moral culpability is attached to you." Even though he was exonerated, Moon was racked with guilt. Pamela Des Barres, a famous groupie and brief romantic partner of Moon, recalled that he once broke down and claimed he was a killer. She told The Sun he would wake up screaming. It was so sad because it was obviously an accident, but he blamed himself.
It would often come up, "Oh, how could I have done that? I'm a murderer."
Peter Yarrow is best known as the Peter in Peter, Paul, and Mary. He's remembered as much for his peace activism as he is for Puff the Magic Dragon.
He's talking.
Oh, Mom, Dad.
He was also convicted of assaulting a teenage girl in 1969, a charge to which he has openly and repeatedly admitted. The victim, who identified herself as Barbara Winter to the Washington Post, recalled that her older sister was president of a Peter Yarrow fan club in Washington, D.C. The two were invited to his hotel room, where he answered the door without clothing and sexually assaulted Winter, who was 14 at the time. Yarrow pleaded guilty to immoral and improper liberties and was sentenced to 1 to 3 years in prison, with all but 3 months suspended. He often called it, quote, "the worst mistake I have ever made." A decade later, he petitioned President Jimmy Carter for a pardon, a petition supported by powerful political friends. He was granted a pardon on Carter's last day in office, to the disgust of the Winter family. The Post also reported that this was far from the only time Yarrow was accused of this. Winter's family sued him on top of the criminal charges, claiming the molestation continued. This ended with an undisclosed settlement. The Cincinnati Enquirer reported that the father of a 15-year-old girl made similar charges in 1967, only to be ignored by a grand jury. Another woman sued Yarrow in February of 2021, claiming that he groomed and assaulted her in 1969. A settlement was reached around April. Billy Preston had a few solo hits, including 2 number ones in Will It Go Round in Circles and Nothing from Nothing, but he's probably best remembered as one of the most important sidemen in rock history. He performed with everyone from Little Richard to the Red Hot Chili Peppers, but his time with the Beatles stands out. His obituary in the New York Times notes that he's the only man to ever share a credit with the Beatles with Get Back. He was part of their legendary rooftop concert chronicled in Let It Be.
If you'd like to do that, you're welcome.
Sure. Beautiful.
Right, and then you'd be on the album.
You're kidding?
That same obituary states that Preston also had a severe drug problem. His issues became especially pronounced in the 90s. He pleaded no contest to assault and cocaine possession charges in 1992 and spent the next 9 months at court-ordered rehab. He was sent to prison again in 1997 after violating probation. But drug addiction is more an illness than a crime. His most serious crime was the $1 million insurance fraud scheme, which he was charged with while already serving time. The indictment in 1998 claimed that Preston, his manager, and at least 5 other people burned their own houses and faked burglaries for almost a decade to scam insurance companies. Preston pleaded guilty a month later and cooperated with prosecutors, with his publicist telling the AP, Preston has taken responsibility for his past mistakes and is looking forward to the future. Much of Johnny Cash's mystique was wrapped up in his outlaw image. The black suits, the legendary live albums recorded in prisons, and enough drugs and bad decisions to fill a biopic helped maintain that image. Even so, he never spent all that much time in a jail cell, recounting one such time where he got locked up for trespassing and picking flowers in Starkville City Jail. That said, he did face trouble with the federal government on one big occasion, when they accused him of burning down a national forest. On June 27, 1965, Cash was, one way or another, at the center of a massive fire in Los Padres National Forest. Cash's FBI file claimed the fire was started by a defective exhaust system on Cash's camper. Damon Fielder, Cash's nephew and camping buddy that day, had a different story. The Los Angeles Times reports that he saw his uncle fanning a fire he lit himself, likely drugged out of his mind and trying to stop it. Cash wrote in his 1997 autobiography that during this time, he was drugged to the gills and ready to fight.
I don't really remember what the charges were, a lot of them.
During a deposition, upon being told that the fire scared off or killed dozens of California condors, he responded, "I don't give a damn about your yellow buzzards." When asked in court if he started the fire, he snapped back, "No, my truck did, and it's dead, so you can't question it." Cash ultimately paid $82,000 in damages. James Brown's many criminal charges, from the alleged to the convicted to the confessed, are numerous enough to fill a book. This includes multiple lawsuits from women accusing him of sexual assault.
How did all of this trouble begin?
Living in America. There's nothing wrong.
The most prominent and public of his accusers was Jackie Hollander, who told her story in depth to CNN. Then a songwriter, she worked with him on a charity single. She claims that he violently assaulted her in 1988 and later blacklisted her from the music business. Hollander spent years trying to get her case heard, to no avail. She eventually tried suing him in 2005, saying the stress from the assault gave her Graves' disease. But per the Chicago Tribune, it was dismissed for being past the statute of limitations. CNN also uncovered 3 other lawsuits against Brown, each from women he employed, and each claiming in gruesome detail how he demanded sexual favors from them. 2 were withdrawn, and 1 resulted in a jury finding him liable for wrongful termination, but not sexual harassment. We love them for their Oscar-worthy performances, diva musicianship, and humanitarian work. Now it's time to visit the final resting places of these stars of the 1960s. John Wayne was already famous before the 60s, but the decade saw the release of some of his biggest films, including his only Oscar-winning role in 1969's True Grit. When he died in 1979, he wasn't exactly given the send-off you'd expect for such an icon. Instead, a small private funeral was held, and he was buried in an unmarked grave. As his son Ethan explained to the Los Angeles Times, "You want him to rest in peace. We didn't want to make a shrine. It's more out of respect for the people that are out there. They don't want their loved ones' graves trampled on." It took almost 20 years before the Wayne family felt comfortable marking the location. The actor is buried at Pacific View Memorial Park in Corona Del Mar, California. His small, flat gravestone is easy to miss, but once you see it, it's quintessentially John Wayne. A lasso borders a relief of a Spanish mission and a view reminiscent of the desert in the Southwest. There's a cowboy on a horse, presumably Wayne himself, and the epitaph reads, Tomorrow is the most important thing in life. Comes into us at midnight very clean. It's perfect when it arrives, and it puts itself in our hands. It hopes we've learned something from yesterday. Jimi Hendrix's music defined the late 60s, with an electric closing act performance at Woodstock among his most iconic moments. When he died in London at the age of 27 in 1970, it was a shock and a tragedy. His body was flown back to his hometown of Seattle for burial. Originally, his family had wanted a large public service complete with bands performing, but in the end, they opted for a small private ceremony. Hendrix is buried at Greenwood Memorial Park in Renton, Washington, in a final resting place befitting a rock legend. It didn't start out that way though, as his original gravesite in the cemetery is marked by a simple plaque. But now, his grave is unmissable thanks to a large marble gazebo. 3 sides are etched with portraits of Hendrix and lyrics from his songs, and more recently, a large sculpture of a guitar was placed in the center of the gazebo. Natalie Wood starred in 60s film classics like West Side Story and Gypsy, but these days she might be even more famous for her mysterious death in 1981 at the age of 43. If rumors of her husband Robert Wagner's involvement in her drowning off the California coast were spreading around the time of her funeral, they at least didn't spoil the event. Laurence Olivier, Fred Astaire, Gene Kelly, Gregory Peck, and Frank Sinatra were in attendance as honorary pallbearers, and actor Roddy McDowall gave a eulogy as he declared, "Wood found not only a way to put life into her art, but art into her life. She has given us a slice of life and serenity."
Natalie Wood was also loved by a world full of audiences, and they too will miss her.
Wood is buried at Westwood Memorial Park in Los Angeles. Her grave is marked by a flat stone with a simple but stylish plaque with reliefs of a rose and a Russian Orthodox cross. The epitaph reads, "More than love," which must have been a phrase that meant a lot to her loved ones, as Wood and Wagner's daughter used it as the title of the biography she wrote about her mother. Omar Sharif looked poised to become a superstar in the 60s after his performances in Lawrence of Arabia and Dr. Zhivago, but by the mid-70s, his career had essentially stalled out. Still, he lived quite a while longer, passing away at the age of 83 in 2015. At the funeral ceremony held in his home country of Egypt, his countryman and fellow actor Hussein Fahmy noted, "Sharif was a man who loved Egypt and represented the Egyptian art in its best form." A crowd surrounded the Cairo Mosque, hoping to say goodbye to one of their most internationally famous stars ever. Sharif is buried in El Saida Nafisa Cemetery in Cairo, or to be more precise, he's entombed there. His grave is in fact an elaborate sheltered tomb, bright white with gold detailing. 2 flat columns rise up from the sides where his head and feet would be. In keeping with Sharif's Islamic faith, there's also a decorative Arabic script on all 4 sides. There is still a significant cult of personality surrounding Elvis Presley, so you can imagine what it was like when he died in 1977 at the age of 42. Unsurprisingly, the funeral drew a ridiculous crowd. 2 women even reportedly died when an unstable man rammed his car into a group of fans outside Presley's Graceland home, just hours before the king was laid to rest. The singer was originally buried at Forest Hill Cemetery, Midtown in Memphis, Tennessee, although his remains are famously no longer there. Nowadays, if you want to pay homage to the king, you need to go to Graceland, which is also in Memphis. His burial place is center stage, with family members buried alongside him, making a semicircle around a large fountain. There are walking paths, as well as huge flower arrangements left by fans, and at the head of his grave is a marble base supporting an eternal flame. A massive slab of marble covers Presley's grave. The plaque on the gravestone takes up almost the whole thing and has an extremely long message written by Elvis's father, part of which reads, "He became a living legend in his own time, earning the respect and love of millions. God saw that he needed some rest and called him home to be with him."
Until we meet you again, may God bless you as He's blessed me. Thank you very much.
Aretha Franklin was known as the Queen of Soul for a reason. In the 60s, she recorded some massive hit songs, including Respect, Think, and Chain of Fools. By the time she died in 2018 at the age of 76, she'd won 18 Grammys and been the first woman inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Franklin was the diva of all divas, and her funeral reflected that. For one thing, it was 8 hours long. It also featured an all-star lineup of performers, including Jennifer Holliday, Stevie Wonder, and Jennifer Hudson. Icons like Cicely Tyson, Clive Davis, and the Reverend Jesse Jackson all spoke, as did former President Bill Clinton. And Tyler Perry was on hand to declare, "I'm grateful to God that we had the fortune to be on this planet at the same time as Aretha Franklin."
And I'm so grateful to God that Aretha walked this earth.
Franklin is interred in Woodlawn Cemetery in Detroit, Michigan. Her crypt is located above 3 other rows, almost touching the ceiling. It's a double crypt, with Franklin centered in gold letters on the marble front and Aretha Louise and her dates set to the left side. Each room of crypts in the mausoleum is styled in a different color of marble, and the singer is in the white room with her father, while 2 of her sisters are nearby in the red room. The 1960s saw Elizabeth Taylor star in some of her most iconic films like Cleopatra and Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. When she died in 2011 at the age of 79, there wasn't much time to plan her funeral, as it was held the day after she passed as per Jewish tradition. She converted to Judaism to marry her 4th husband, Eddie Fisher, and still practiced decades later. Taylor is interred in the Great Mausoleum at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California. This is basically the place to be laid to rest if you're a Hollywood celebrity. Other icons whose final resting places are within a stone's throw of Taylor's include James Stewart, Clark Gable, Errol Flynn, Humphrey Bogart, and Spencer Tracy. The remains of so many notable people are buried there that Time magazine once called it the New World's Westminster Abbey. Even though Taylor is surrounded by other elaborate crypts, you can't miss her final resting place. It's marked by a virtually life-size statue of a white angel, spreading its wings wide and its arms outstretched. It stands on a large marble plinth with Taylor's name and dates carved in gold, and in the wall behind the angel are the words "In Memoria." Ray Charles won his first Grammy in 1961. Over the course of the ensuing decade, he lived quite the life, which included releasing a country album and getting arrested for heroin possession. Fortunately, he kicked his drug habit and lived until 2004 when he passed away at the age of 73.
If you want to stop smoking, you can quit smoking if you want to.
At Charles's funeral, other stars like B.B. King, Willie Nelson, and Stevie Wonder all performed. Clint Eastwood spoke, as did the Reverend Jesse Jackson, who painted a picture of what Charles might get up to in the afterlife. As he put it, "Now heaven has a maestro. Ray, when you first get there, before you meet Count Basie, before you meet Duke Ellington, before you meet family and friends, there's a man over there across the river who is giving sight to the blind." Charles is interred at Inglewood Park Cemetery in Inglewood, California. His crypt is in the Eternal Love Corridor of the Mausoleum of the Golden West, surrounded by dozens of others, as well as a columbarium wall that holds urns. The white marble face of his crypt is labeled with a simple plaque stating his name and dates. The only nod to his musical career is a small relief of a treble clef on a music staff. There's also a small vase for family and friends to leave floral tributes. Audrey Hepburn had a relatively short career, at least by the standards of Hollywood icons who didn't die at a young age. The 1960s saw her at her pinnacle, as she starred in such classics like My Fair Lady, Sabrina, and Wait Until Dark during that decade. But soon afterwards, she mostly gave up acting, appearing in only 4 more movies in the next 20 years. But there was a good reason for that. Hepburn had found other things that she loved, as she focused on carrying out good deeds. This was evident at her funeral in 1993, where her eulogy was given by Prince Saruddin Aga Khan, the former United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. He reflected on her work with the organization as he noted, "When she went out to the refugee camps, to the squalor of the tents, the mud hovels, think of what she brought to these children. She reached out to them with her smile, with her hands, with her heart."
I've been, so privileged to be given this opportunity to do something for children.
Hepburn is buried at the Cimetière des Tolochenaz in Tolochenaz, Switzerland. She had lived in the country ever since she basically retired from Hollywood in 1967. She has a very traditional grave covered in a large flat stone, marked with a headstone in the shape of a cross, etched with her name and dates. While it may be a difficult location for many of her fans to access, someone is obviously tending to her grave, as images taken through the years show it completely covered with different seasonal flowering plants. Edie Sedgwick might not be super famous in the 21st century, but for a brief shining moment in the 1960s, she was absolutely huge. She met Andy Warhol in the middle of the decade and became his muse, appearing in some of the iconic pop artist's short films. She made headlines in magazine covers in 1965 as she was dubbed a superstar, It Girl, Girl of the Year, and a youth Quaker. But her star burned out quickly. Sedgwick struggled with substance abuse and had a nervous breakdown, as she also attempted suicide at least once. She died of a drug overdose in 1971 at the age of 28. Despite coming from a prominent New England family that had its own burial plot dating back over a century, she wasn't buried along with them or anywhere near them. Instead, she's buried at Oak Hill Cemetery in Ballard, California. A simple stone with her name and dates marks her final resting place. Her epitaph reads simply, "Wife of Michael Brett Post," even though she was married to Post for only 3 months. If you or anyone you know is struggling with addiction issues, help is available. Visit the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration website or contact SAMHSA's National Helpline at 1-800-662-HELP 4357. Which of the greatest bands of all time suddenly fell apart when their leaders died young? What band basically invented punk rock a decade before it broke out? Keep watching to find out. The Ramones and the Sex Pistols are frequently cited as pioneers of punk rock, but the Stooges, led by often shirtless wildman Iggy Pop, were among the first bands to truly capture the essence of the genre. Judy Berman argues as much for Pitchfork, saying that Iggy's live performances were full of uncontainable, furious energy. He wore dog collars, cut himself with glass, and gyrated across the stage in a way that many hard rock frontmen would study in decades to come. Other bands years later would further develop the sneering attitude and rapid power chords we typically associate with old-school punk. But the spiritual foundations of the genre were hammered into the beer-covered ground of seedy clubs by the Stooges. It wouldn't be particularly out of the ordinary in 1979 or 1983, but for the late 60s, it was nothing short of revolutionary, even if the world had no idea what to do with these guys, costing them deserved commercial success. But they've only gained respect in the years since, as their influence has become increasingly difficult to ignore. In 2010, after 7 consecutive rejections, Iggy and the Stooges were finally inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Iggy said to the crowd during their performance, quote, "Come on, rich people, show us you're not too rich to be cool." What's more punk than that? It's common knowledge that the mid to late 60s were a time of countercultural revolution, often expressed through rock music. But rock music was still a man's world, at least until Janis Joplin showed up. As lead singer of Big Brother and the Holding Company, Joplin shook up the rock and roll patriarchy, coming out of the San Francisco scene to become a worldwide phenomenon. Joplin's signature wail and gravelly voice defined a new movement and sound that combined the blues with psychedelic rock to create sonic magic. Tragically, Joplin died of an overdose in 1970 at the age of 27, not long after leaving Big Brother and the Holding Company to embark on a successful solo career. But the Queen of Rock had already established herself as a rock legend by this point. By necessity, she did it by overcoming institutional barriers of sexism. Singer-songwriter Tracy Nelson, who appeared on a bill with Joplin in 1966, told NPR, "I had to follow Janis Joplin, and I'm standing out there listening to her, and I'm just thinking, man, this is a force of nature." Force of nature might be the closest words can come to describing Joplin's voice to the majority of us who never had the privilege of hearing it live. For Rolling Stone, one of the elements that made the Doors so important was their recognition that, amidst all the flower power hippie sentimentality that dominated mid-60s mainstream rock, the decade had a dark side: drugs, Vietnam, fierce national divisions. In that sense, the Doors were the embodiment of that era. Their music wasn't angry or particularly heavy. In fact, the band didn't even have a bass player, opting instead for organist Ray Manzarek to hold down the low end of the songs. And like other bands of their era, the guys in the Doors looked like anyone you'd run into on the street, but it was all dark and mysterious and rebellious and exciting in its own way. Perhaps frontman Jim Morrison indulged in that darkness because he was intimately familiar with the hedonism and drug abuse his music channeled the energy of. The Lizard King was something of a rebel without a cause, whose behavior stemmed from personal pain rather than an organized political viewpoint, and whose untimely death has both rehabilitated and immortalized his music as a symbol of youthful rebellion. In a tribute to the Doors for Rolling Stone, Marilyn Manson wrote, "They didn't sound anything like punk rock, but Morrison outshined everyone else when it came to rebellion and not playing by anyone else's rules." The Velvet Underground, led by Lou Reed, is one of those bands you always hear about but rarely hear on the radio. Julian Casablancas wrote in Rolling Stone that their music is almost non-existent on classic rock radio. Why is it always Boston and Led Zeppelin? And why are the Rolling Stones so much more popular than the Velvets? There is also a part of me that has always felt that it should have been the other way around. There's an argument to be made for that. Casablancas goes on to say the Velvets were ahead of their time and just plain weird, and that their experimental music could transport you and teach you how to be yourself. High praise, but how influential were they really? The BBC asks a provocative question. Are they as important to music history as the Beatles? It claims that the Velvets' first 4 studio albums contain the DNA of everything from indie and alternative rock to nearly all forms of punk. Then it lists some artists who cite the Velvets as a foundational influence. The names are impressive. U2, the Sex Pistols, R.E.M., the Talking Heads, Sonic Youth, even David Bowie.
There were elements of what Lou was doing that I thought were just unavoidably right for both the times and for where music was going.
You're unlikely to stumble across Velvet Underground tunes on your morning commute, but if you like any alternative bands at all, you owe it to them to check out the 60s group that made it all possible. Any conversation about the origins of hard rock simply must include a proper tribute to The Who. As Pearl Jam's Eddie Vedder wrote for Rolling Stone, they wanted to be louder, so they had Jim Marshall invent the 100-watt amp. Needed more volume, so they began stacking them. It is said that the first guitar feedback ever to make it to record was on Anyway, Anyhow, Anywhere in 1965. They also set the standard for rock excesses. As all rock fans know, late drummer Keith Moon was famous for trashing hotel rooms, which so many later rock groups copied. And Pete Townsend pioneered the art of smashing your guitar on stage, another staple of rock royalty excess copied by generations. But The Who's legacy stretches beyond power chords and partying until dawn. Vedder wrote, "The Who told stories within the confines of a song, and over the course of an entire album, pushed boundaries. The Who quite possibly remain the greatest live band ever." On My Generation, Pete Townsend famously wrote, "I hope I die before I get old." Luckily for everyone, it didn't happen. He and frontman Roger Daltrey, who still has that golden voice, are now in their 70s, and they are still rocking out as hard as ever. Nothing you'll likely notice about the Beach Boys on the surface, from the 5 members smiling as they played, to their often matching bright uniforms and harmless nice guy haircuts, to the infectious earworm hooks and gorgeous harmonies on songs like Good Vibrations and albums like Pet Sounds that were seemingly designed in a lab to put a smile on your face, betrays the darkness and turmoil that define their story. Rough upbringings, conflicts, firings, untimely deaths, and the tumultuous mental health journey of frontman Brian Wilson all took their toll on the Beach Boys and derailed them at the height of their popularity, though not before they also inspired other bands to create some of the greatest works in music history.
We heard Pet Sounds and thought, right, we've got to do something better than that.
Yeah.
So we did Sgt. Pepper.
But as Fleetwood Mac frontman Lindsey Buckingham writes for Rolling Stone, the group's legacy will never not be the magic of their music. I remember hearing Surfin' Safari first when I was in 6th grade. It had the beat, the sense of joy, that explosion rock and roll gave to a lot of us. But it also had this incredible lift, this amazing kind of chemical reaction that seemed to happen inside you when you heard it. The thing is, it doesn't really matter where you are when you hear a Beach Boys song. The bus, the office, in traffic. When those harmonies on Pet Sounds hit, you're simply transported, flying down a coastal California highway with the windows down and your arm out the window. Few people in history have changed the way an instrument is played more than Jimi Hendrix, leader of the Jimi Hendrix Experience. He changed rock guitar forever. When he first arrived, the guitar was played with little distortion and only the simplest, most reserved solos. Hendrix reverse-engineered it, unlocking entirely new forms of playing and arguably becoming the first true guitar hero. And Hendrix never seemed to break a sweat doing any of this. Playing the guitar appeared to come as easily and as naturally to Hendrix as breathing and speaking does for the rest of us. He experimented with distortion, shredding, whammy bars, and a funky tone in a psychedelic way that revolutionized music moving forward. The Purple Haze and All Along the Watchtower Rockers performance at Woodstock is the stuff of rock and roll legend. But Glider magazine argues that the virtuoso's influence stretched far beyond the guitar, and he ultimately impacted everything from funk to 90s Seattle grunge rock to even hip-hop music, due to him being frequently sampled and lyrically referenced. It all goes to show that the best way to leave a truly immortal legacy isn't just to write music that's still listened to years later, but to influence countless other artists across multiple genres who will carry your ideas and your creative spirit to new generations. You've probably heard it said a million times that classic rock bands and artists had their stylistic roots in the blues, and so did the Rolling Stones, of course. According to You Discover Music, the blues is such an intimate part of their sonic DNA that they even took their name from a Muddy Waters song. Then they went on to bring blues to a wider audience. But the influence of the Rolling Stones didn't come close to stopping there. Their songs, Satisfaction, Paint It Black, Get Off of My Cloud, Sympathy for the Devil, You Can't Always Get What You Want, Jumpin' Jack Flash, and so on, are timeless hits and still some of the most commonly heard tunes on classic rock radio. They also made iconic album covers and even influenced fashion, playing a huge role in replacing the suits and bowl cuts look of old school 50s artists with the longer hair and wilder colors we more typically associate with rock stars. And it's worth noting that in a recent poll, their tongue and lip logo beat out the Nike swoosh and the Batman symbol to become the most iconic t-shirt logo ever. But perhaps the Stones' greatest legacy to the world of rock was their attitude. Mick Jagger and Keith Richards still embody the sneering, rebellious spirit of rock and roll, despite somehow surviving long enough to become respected elder statesmen of the genre at large. It hardly needs to be said, the Beatles aren't just the greatest band of the 1960s, but are in the running for the most important musical act of all time. Fittingly, Rolling Stone named the Beatles #1 on their list of the top 100 artists in pop music history. It's one of those lists where fans can argue themselves to death over who should outrank who or be included at all, but few would argue with the placement of the Beatles at the top of the pile. Elvis Costello wrote a tribute for Rolling Stone, highlighting the fact that unlike many rock and pop groups that came before them, the Beatles created their own songs. Every record was a shock when it came out. They made writing your own material expected rather than exceptional. This is a band that seemed to know it wouldn't stick together forever, and it set out to revolutionize music as much as possible in just a few years in the late 60s. What's strange is that they weren't even performing live for a good chunk of that short span. NME says that they stopped doing concerts well before their split because the crowds drowned out their playing. As Costello eloquently put it, the songs weren't theirs anymore. They were everybody's.
I'm amazed at the audience reaction and stuff, and because it's like I still don't believe it.